In this episode, we're going to talk about measurement in a way that is practical and honest, because measuring policy adoption and compliance is one of the quickest ways to tell whether governance is working or merely looking busy. In cybersecurity, it is easy to confuse activity with progress, especially when teams are producing documents, running meetings, and closing tickets. But a security program does not become effective because it generates motion. It becomes effective because the motion changes risk outcomes in a measurable way. Policy measurement is the bridge between written expectations and real-world behavior, and it should help leaders make decisions, not just fill out dashboards. The phrase meaningful, decision-ready indicators is important because it implies that every measurement should answer a question someone actually needs answered, and it should suggest what to do next when the number changes. If measurement does not guide action, it becomes noise that people learn to ignore. For beginners, this matters because the exam and the real world both reward the ability to think in outcomes, evidence, and feedback loops rather than in vague claims of being secure. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful place to start is by distinguishing adoption from compliance, because these are related but different, and confusing them creates misleading conclusions. Adoption is about whether people are using the policy-aligned process, such as submitting requests through the right path, capturing approvals, or following escalation routes. Compliance is about whether the requirements are being met, such as whether access is appropriately limited, whether sensitive data is handled correctly, or whether required reviews are performed on time. Adoption without compliance can happen when people follow the process but misunderstand the standard, or when the process itself is flawed. Compliance without adoption can happen when teams scramble to look compliant during audits while day-to-day behavior still bypasses the process. If you measure only adoption, you may miss that the control is ineffective. If you measure only compliance, you may miss that the process is brittle and will collapse under pressure. Decision-ready measurement keeps both in view so the organization can see not only what is happening, but why it is happening and where to intervene. This framing also reduces blame because it encourages leaders to fix systems rather than accusing people based on incomplete signals. Meaningful indicators begin with a clear link to the policy's guiding principle and intended outcome, because without that link you end up measuring what is easy rather than what matters. If a policy exists to reduce unauthorized access to critical systems, then indicators should reflect access scope, access approvals, and the frequency of risky access patterns, not just the number of times a form was filled out. If a policy exists to improve incident response readiness, then indicators should reflect detection and response performance, such as how quickly events are triaged and how consistently escalation occurs, not just whether a planned document exists. A beginner mistake is treating measurement as a separate project, but measurement should be designed alongside policy, because policy should be written in a way that makes it measurable. When policy requirements are vague, measurement becomes subjective, and subjective measurement becomes political. When policy requirements are clear, measurement can be objective, and objective measurement supports improvement. The goal is not perfect precision, but useful evidence that supports better decisions. Decision-ready indicators have a special property. They imply a response. If the indicator moves in the wrong direction, you should know what kind of action to take, and if it improves, you should know what practice to reinforce. For example, if the indicator shows that approvals for sensitive access are consistently delayed, the next action might be to refine the procedure, clarify decision criteria, or allocate additional approver capacity. If the indicator shows that exceptions are increasing, the next action might be to investigate whether the policy is unrealistic, whether a specific workflow is broken, or whether teams need enablement. If an indicator shows improved timeliness of reviews, the next action might be to recognize the teams involved and then expand the pattern. Indicators that do not lead to action are often vanity metrics, because they may look informative but they do not change behavior. In security, time is precious, so measurement must earn its place by leading to better choices. For exam thinking, Answers that emphasize decision-ready measurement often align with mature governance concepts because they connect evidence to accountability and improvement. To make indicators meaningful, you should be careful about choosing measures that can be manipulated without improving security, because people respond to what is measured. If you measure the number of tickets closed, teams might close easy tickets and delay hard ones, which does not reduce risk. If you measure the number of trainings completed, people might click through training without learning, which does not change behavior. Good indicators resist gaming because they reflect real outcomes or real constraints that cannot be faked easily. For example, measuring the percentage of privileged access that is time-bound and justified is harder to game than measuring how many access requests were submitted. Measuring the time from detection to containment for a class of incidents is harder to game than measuring how many alerts were acknowledged. This does not mean you should never measure activity. It means activity measures should be paired with outcome-related measures so the organization cannot feel successful just by being busy. When measurement discourages gaming, it supports honesty, and honesty is the foundation for improvement. Another important concept is leading versus lagging indicators, because both are useful, but they answer different questions. Lagging indicators reflect outcomes that happened, like incidents, outages, or confirmed policy violations, and they are valuable because they show real impact. The weakness is that lagging indicators often arrive after harm has already occurred. Leading indicators reflect conditions that predict future outcomes, like the presence of risky access patterns, delays in patching high-impact systems, or lack of logging coverage on critical assets. Leading indicators are valuable because they give you a chance to intervene before failure. A mature measurement approach uses both, because lagging indicators validate whether the program is making a difference, while leading indicators guide where to invest next. For beginners, it helps to imagine that lagging indicators tell you the story of what went wrong, while leading indicators tell you where the next problem is likely to emerge. When you see exam questions about measurement, the best answer often includes a combination of indicators that support both early intervention and long-term validation. Indicators also need to be scoped carefully, because measuring everything creates noise and measuring nothing creates blindness. The scope should align with what the policy covers, such as a class of systems, a category of data, or a set of processes. If scope is too broad, the signal gets diluted and you cannot tell where the problem is. If scope is too narrow, you may improve a small area while missing the main source of risk. Practical measurement often begins with the highest impact areas, such as systems that matter most to business operations or data types that carry the greatest harm if exposed. This aligns with the idea of focusing on measurable outcomes and prioritizing based on risk. It also makes measurement more credible because stakeholders can see why those areas were chosen. Over time, as measurement practices mature, scope can expand, but the starting point should be the places where decisions matter most. A decision-ready indicator should help you decide where to focus, and that requires thoughtful scope. For adoption measurement, one of the most useful approaches is to measure process health, because healthy processes tend to produce consistent compliance over time. Process health can be reflected in indicators like timeliness of approvals, frequency of escalations, completeness of required documentation, or the percentage of tasks that follow the defined workflow. These indicators tell you whether the policy is being integrated into daily work or whether it remains a paper expectation. If process health is poor, the policy may be too confusing, too burdensome, or misaligned with operational realities. Fixing process health often improves compliance indirectly because it reduces friction and uncertainty. This is why adoption measurement is not a side project. It is a diagnostic tool that reveals where governance needs adjustment. For beginners, the key idea is that if people are not using the process, it is unlikely that the requirements are being met consistently, because unmanaged behavior tends to drift. Adoption indicators help you catch that drift early before it becomes a major failure. For compliance measurement, the focus shifts to whether the required conditions are being met, and this usually requires indicators that reflect control effectiveness rather than just process participation. If a policy requires least privilege, compliance indicators might reflect how access aligns with roles, how quickly access is removed when no longer needed, or how much high-risk access is present without justification. If a policy requires that sensitive actions be auditable, Compliance indicators might reflect whether critical systems are producing logs that can support investigation and whether those logs are retained appropriately. If a policy requires that changes be reviewed for impact, compliance indicators might reflect whether high-impact changes receive the required review and whether the review is recorded. The key is to choose indicators that map directly to the policy requirement in observable terms. Compliance measurement can be challenging because it may require data collection across systems, but the principle remains the same. Measure the condition the policy requires, not just the activity around it. When compliance indicators are chosen well, they reveal where controls are weakening and where corrective action should be focused. A meaningful measurement system also includes thresholds and interpretation guidance, because numbers without context do not guide decisions. If an indicator is trending upward, is that good or bad? And how much change is significant enough to act on? Without interpretation, leaders may overreact to normal variation or ignore slow deterioration. Thresholds do not need to be perfect to be useful. They need to be reasonable and tied to risk tolerance. For example, an organization might decide that high-risk exceptions must remain below a certain level, or that approvals for sensitive actions must occur within a certain time window to prevent unsafe bypasses. Interpretation guidance also helps avoid misusing indicators as blunt weapons, because indicators should drive improvement, not punishment. When indicators are used to shame teams hide problems, and measurement becomes less accurate. When indicators are used to identify constraints and coordinate support, teams become more honest, and the program improves faster. Decision-ready measurement requires not only data, but disciplined interpretation and a healthy response culture. Indicators should also support transparency, because transparency builds trust and makes accountability feel fair. If measurement is hidden, stakeholders will assume it is either being used for surveillance or being used to protect leadership from scrutiny. If measurement is visible and explained, teams can understand expectations and can self-correct before problems escalate. Transparency also reduces the chance of surprise audits or sudden escalations, because issues can be surfaced and addressed earlier. This does not mean every metric must be public to everyone. It means the relevant stakeholders should have access to the signals they need to manage the policy effectively. Transparency also creates a shared reality, which reduces debates driven by anecdotes. When everyone can see the same signal, discussions become more about what to do and less about whether the problem exists. For beginners, it is useful to remember that transparency is part of governance, because governance depends on shared understanding. Without shared understanding, enforcement becomes inconsistent, and inconsistency undermines trust. As measurement matures, you also need to ensure that indicators remain aligned as the environment changes, because what was meaningful last year may become less meaningful after a major architecture shift or workflow change. This is why measurement itself needs a life cycle, with periodic review to confirm that indicators still reflect risk and still drive useful decisions. If an indicator becomes disconnected from reality, teams may chase improvements that do not matter, which wastes time and can even increase risk by distracting from real problems. This is where policy lifecycle governance connects back, because ownership and cadence should apply to the measurement system as well. Indicators should be refined based on feedback, incidents, audits, and observed gaming behaviors. When measurement evolves intentionally, it remains trustworthy. When it is neglected, it becomes noise. A decision-ready indicator is not a permanent truth. It is a tool that must remain sharp. To close, measuring adoption and compliance with meaningful, decision-ready indicators is how you keep governance honest and effective over time. Adoption indicators show whether the policy is being integrated into daily work, and compliance indicators show whether the required conditions are actually being met. Meaningful indicators are tied to guiding principles and outcomes, and decision-ready indicators imply actions when they move. Strong measurement avoids gaming, balances leading and lagging signals, uses thoughtful scope, includes interpretation guidance, and is transparent enough to build trust rather than fear. For exam thinking, mature answers usually connect measurement to accountability and improvement, emphasizing that metrics exist to drive decisions and reduce risk rather than to create reports. When you build measurement this way, policies stop being static documents and become living controls whose effectiveness can be observed and strengthened. In cybersecurity, that feedback loop is what turns governance into resilience, because resilience depends on seeing reality clearly and adjusting before small drift becomes major failure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.